I was halfway across the reception hall, making my way to the back where my catering staff was stationed, when I heard my name ring out through the microphone, sharp and dripping with amusement. Oh, and look who decided to crawl out of the woodwork. My Aunt Meredith's voice echoed across the marble floor, instantly drawing the attention of over 100 guests. I stopped in my tracks, my stomach clenching as I turned to see her standing at the head table, one hand gripping a flute of champagne, the other gesturing dramatically in my direction. You all remember my dear niece, don't you? The one who, oh, what was it again, Gerald? She turned to my uncle, who was already chuckling to himself, the kind of deep, self-satisfied laugh that came from a man who thought he had the whole world in his pocket. Wasn't she supposed to be off chasing some pipe dream? What was it again? Oh, right, business. The room erupted into polite, amused laughter, the kind that made my blood simmer under my skin. I wasn't surprised. Meredith and Gerald had spent years perfecting the art of publicly demeaning me, of making me feel small and insignificant every time I was forced to be in the same room with them. And tonight, on the night of my cousin Emily's lavish wedding reception, they had a captive audience. I could see the smirks, the poorly concealed amusement on the faces of their equally insufferable friends, the same people who had written me off years ago. The people who thought success meant power suits and boardrooms, not rolling up your sleeves and building something with your own hands. I forced a smile, ignoring the way my nails dug into my palm. It's good to see you too, Aunt Meredith, I said smoothly, my voice carrying just enough warmth to disguise the venom underneath. I could have left it at that. I could have turned and walked away, swallowed the humiliation like I had a dozen times before. But tonight, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the months of hard work that had gone into this event, the 16-hour days, the stress of making sure every single plate that left my kitchen was nothing short of perfection. Maybe it was the fact that they didn't care, that every bite their precious guests had taken tonight, every dish they had raved about, every tiny detail that had made this reception the grand spectacle they wanted, was because of me. Gerald grinned, raising his glass. Well, whatever it is you're doing these days, I hope it's paying the bills. Wouldn't want you struggling too much out there. Maybe next time, we can pull some strings and get you a real job. A chorus of chuckles followed, and I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. I wasn't a teenager anymore, standing awkwardly in the corner while they dismissed me like I was an afterthought. I wasn't some lost kid trying to prove my worth to people who had never once respected me. No, tonight was different. Tonight, they were standing on my turf, benefiting from my success, and they had no idea. I tilted my head, my smile never faltering. Oh, I don't think that'll be necessary, I said lightly, stepping closer to the head table. After all, you already did hire me. For the first time, the laughter quieted, confusion flickering across Meredith's face. Excuse me? I turned, gesturing toward the waitstaff moving seamlessly through the room, the chef still busy in the back preparing the final course, the bartenders expertly mixing handcrafted cocktails at the open bar. The catering company you hired for this little soiree? I met her eyes, watching the exact moment the realization dawned on her. It's mine. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence that stretched across the entire ballroom, interrupted only by the distant clatter of silverware and hushed murmurs from the guests who had been close enough to hear. Meredith's mouth opened and closed, her perfectly Botoxed expression flickering between disbelief and horror. Gerald's grip tightened around his glass, his knuckles white as he shifted in his chair, suddenly far less amused than he had been moments ago. I let the moment stretch, enjoying the stunned expressions, the way the energy of the room had shifted in my favor. And then, without breaking eye contact, I turned on my heel and walked straight toward my head chef, who was standing just behind the service station, watching the scene unfold with barely concealed curiosity. Pack it up, I said, my voice even, measured. He blinked. What? I turned back toward the hall, toward the sea of guests who were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, toward my aunt and uncle, who looked like they had swallowed their own tongues. Every single tray, every dish, every bottle behind the bar. I wanted out. Now. A ripple of gasps spread through the room, guests glancing at each other in confusion as waiters hesitated, unsure if they had misheard me. Meredith shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. I met her eyes, feeling something inside me settle, a cold satisfaction washing over me. "Oh," I said, my smile widening, "I absolutely would." And just like that, the chaos began. The moment my words left my mouth, the entire reception hall shifted. Guests who had been sipping their expensive wine and laughing just minutes ago now looked around in confusion as waiters, still unsure whether this was some elaborate joke, hesitated before moving toward the food stations. The string quartet in the corner faltered for just a second before the violinist caught herself and continued playing, though the notes suddenly felt out of place in the growing tension. My staff, trained professionals who had never seen me pull something like this before, exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for me to confirm that I was serious. I was. Meredith's hands slammed down on the table, rattling the glassware as she stared at me with wide, incredulous eyes. "This isn't funny. You're not actually doing this." Her voice had lost its earlier mockery, now teetering between disbelief and barely concealed panic. I stayed exactly where I was, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, while my team started clearing the buffet, closing down the open bar and pulling full trays of untouched hors d'oeuvres from the servers' hands. Gerald, who had spent years treating me like a joke, had finally lost his smirk. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, his voice lower now, his arrogance cracking just slightly. "All right, enough," he said, forcing a chuckle that didn't quite land. "You've made your point. But this is a wedding. You can't just..." I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with one of my senior chefs, a man who had worked under me for years, someone who trusted me enough to follow my lead even when he didn't understand my reasoning. "Everything. I want it gone." That was all it took. Whatever doubts my team had, whatever hesitation had been lingering, evaporated as they moved swiftly, efficiently, the way I had trained them to. Linen-draped tables were stripped bare, trays of seafood and artisan bread disappeared within seconds, entire chafing dishes filled with perfectly cooked filet mignon were wheeled away before the guests even realized what was happening. The sound of murmurs turned into hushed arguments, confusion morphing into growing distress as people started noticing that their plates had been taken mid-bite, their wine glasses snatched from their hands. Across the room, Emily, the bride, had finally registered what was happening. She had been too wrapped up in the congratulations and attention to notice at first, but now she was staring at me, her face going pale as her fingers gripped the fabric of her expensive dress. "Wait, what is going on?" she asked, but no one answered her because the entire situation had already spiraled out of control. Meredith's chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly, knocking her napkin to the ground. Her entire body was rigid, her carefully maintained composure cracking apart in real time. "You think you can embarrass me like this?" Her voice was rising, her volume increasing as she fought to regain control of the situation, as if sheer force of will could undo what was already set in motion. "You think you can humiliate our family in front of all these people?" I finally moved, stepping closer to her, lowering my voice just enough that only she and Gerald could hear me. "You humiliated me first," I said simply, watching as her nostrils flared, as the realization of what was happening fully settled in. "For years, you've laughed at me, mocked me, treated me like I was nothing. You've never respected me, never acknowledged what I've built, never once considered that I might be worth more than the insults you've thrown at me. Well, now you get to see exactly what happens when you push someone too far." Gerald was already pulling out his phone, probably trying to call another catering company, but he should have known it was too late. No company worth their reputation would step in at the last minute for an event of this size, not when the entire operation had already been shut down. They could try, of course, but by the time they found replacements, the reception would be over, the guests long gone, the damage irreparable. Emily finally forced her way to the table, her voice shrill with panic. "You can't do this. This is my wedding." She turned to her parents, her hands shaking. "Fix this. Right now." Meredith, who had always been so perfectly poised, so sure of herself, looked at me with something I had never seen from her before, genuine fear. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice quieter now, her earlier bravado slipping away as she realized she no longer had control. "You don't want to make an enemy of this family." I let her words hang in the air for a moment before tilting my head slightly. "I think I already have." With that, I turned away, leaving them standing there, stunned and helpless, while the last trays of food were carried out of the hall. The guests, left with nothing but half-empty plates and confusion, started murmuring louder, the realization settling in that there would be no dinner, no more drinks, no perfectly plated desserts. A few of them were already reaching for their coats, making quiet excuses as they prepared to leave, not wanting to be part of whatever disaster was unfolding. From the other side of the room, I caught sight of a familiar figure, my mother. She had stayed quiet for most of the night, watching everything unfold from the shadows, never stepping in to defend me, never interfering when Meredith and Gerald took their jabs. But now, she was staring at me, her expression unreadable, as if she wasn't sure whether to be horrified or impressed. I met her gaze, waiting for her to say something, to tell me that I had gone too far, that I had made a mistake. But she said nothing. She just stood there, gripping the edges of her dress, before slowly lowering her eyes, looking away. That was all the confirmation I needed. I had done the right thing. And there was no going back now. The last of the serving trays disappeared through the doors, leaving only bare tables and a silent crowd of overdressed guests who were beginning to realize that this wasn't some elaborate prank or dramatic speech meant to be laughed off. Conversations were turning into hushed arguments, people glancing toward the head table for answers, while the scent of freshly cooked food still lingered in the air, taunting them with the fact that their extravagant dinner had been carried away before they could even finish chewing. The wedding planner, a woman whose entire career revolved around preventing disasters like this, had finally caught on to the situation, her phone clutched in her trembling hands as she whispered frantically into it, probably begging for a miracle that wasn't coming. Emily was still in the middle of the room, her perfectly styled hair shaking as she turned to her father, demanding that he do something, anything, to salvage what was left. But Gerald, the man who had always had the loudest voice in every conversation, was silent for the first time, his grip still tight around his useless phone. I made my way toward the exit, walking past guests who avoided eye contact, past waiters who looked at me like they were waiting for confirmation that this was really happening. One of my managers, an older woman who had been working under me for years, reached out as I passed. "Are you sure about this?" she asked in a low voice, her eyes flicking toward the growing tension at the front of the hall. "We could leave the bar open, at least. Let them drink their embarrassment away." I could tell she wasn't questioning me out of doubt, but out of practicality. She had seen the way I had been treated over the years, knew exactly why I was doing this, but there was still a part of her that was weighing the consequences. I met her eyes for a brief second, considering it, before shaking my head. "Close everything," I said firmly, and that was all she needed to hear before turning back toward the staff, making sure the last bottles of wine were packed away. Before I could reach the doors, I heard my name cut through the growing chaos, sharp and furious. "You are not walking away from this." Meredith's voice cracked slightly, the first sign that her usual mask of control had slipped entirely. She was moving now, pushing past the empty tables, her heels clicking against the marble floor with short, clipped steps. "You think you can just humiliate us and leave?" I stopped, not because she had ordered me to, but because I wanted her to stand there and face what she had done. I turned slowly, watching as her breath came out in short, angry bursts, her carefully maintained poise unraveling in front of everyone. Gerald had finally risen from his seat, his fingers pressing against the table as if steadying himself, his face twisted in something between rage and disbelief. "Fix this," he ordered, his voice low and sharp, the same voice he had used for years when speaking to waiters who weren't fast enough or employees who weren't worth his attention. I crossed my arms, tilting my head slightly. "Fix what?" I asked, my voice calm despite the heat building inside me. "You're the ones who made a spectacle out of me. You're the ones who mocked me in front of your guests. I just decided to play along. Emily had finally found her voice again, stepping between her parents and me, her face red with barely contained frustration. "You're ruining my wedding," she said, each word shaking. "Do you even understand that? I don't care what my parents said to you. I don't care about your personal issues with them. This is my night, not yours." I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral even as her words pushed against my patience. "Then maybe you should have said something," I said simply, and her face twisted in confusion. "Maybe, when they started making their little jokes, when they turned me into the entertainment for their rich friends, you could have told them to stop. But you didn't. You laughed with them. You sat there while they humiliated me, and you said nothing." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "So now, I'm saying something for you." Meredith exhaled sharply, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "You're making a mistake," she hissed, her voice so low that only I could hear her. "You think this will make you look powerful? It won't. It will make you look bitter and pathetic. And when the dust settles, you'll realize that you've burned every bridge you ever had with this family." I stared at her, at the woman who had spent years treating me like I wasn't worth her time, who had dismissed every accomplishment I had made, who had never once considered me an equal. And for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no resentment, just the quiet certainty that she had never been a bridge worth keeping in the first place. I took a slow step back, turning toward the exit without another word. But just before I reached the doors, another voice called out, one I hadn't expected. "Wait." I turned my head slightly, my body going still as I saw my mother rising from her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. For the first time that night, she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at them. At Meredith, at Gerald, at Emily, at every guest who had sat there and watched as they dragged me through the dirt. "You've all done enough," she said, her voice quiet but firm, the kind of voice she had never used in their presence before. "She's not the one who ruined this night. You are." Silence fell over the room again, heavier this time, not from confusion, but from the weight of her words. Meredith's head snapped toward her, her face unreadable, while Gerald's grip tightened around his useless phone. Emily's mouth opened slightly, as if trying to form a response, but nothing came out. I should have been surprised, but I wasn't. Maybe deep down, I had always known my mother wasn't as blind to their treatment of me as she had pretended to be. Maybe I had been waiting for this moment, for her to finally stop sitting in silence. I met her eyes, just for a second, just long enough to see the quiet apology that lingered there. Then I turned and walked out the door. I stepped outside into the crisp night air, the muffled chaos of the reception hall still audible behind me, but I didn't stop walking. I could hear the doors swinging open again, hurried footsteps following, but I didn't turn around. My pulse was steady, my mind was clear, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed these people anything, not an explanation, not an apology, not even my attention. I had spent too many years standing in the background while they made a joke out of me, and now they could stand there and watch while I left. "You are not walking away from this conversation." Meredith's voice was sharp and clipped as she finally caught up to me, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. "You are going to turn around, and we are going to fix this now." I stopped but didn't face her right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough that I could hear the growing urgency in her breathing, the desperation creeping into her tone. When I finally turned, I saw what I had been waiting for, the carefully constructed mask she always wore had cracked. Her hands were trembling slightly, her mouth pressed into a tight line, her usual air of control slipping with every second that passed. Gerald was right behind her, his jaw clenched so tightly that I could see the muscles twitching. Emily had followed too, standing just a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to disappear into the expensive fabric of her wedding dress. I met Meredith's stare, watching as she struggled to regain control of the situation, watching as she tried to intimidate me the way she always had. But this time, there was nothing left for her to take from me. "There's nothing to fix," I said evenly. "You got exactly what you deserved." Her face twisted in disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend the fact that someone was speaking to her this way. You ruined my daughter's wedding, she hissed, taking a step closer, her fingers twitching like she wanted to grab me by the arm and force me back inside. You embarrassed our family in front of everyone. Do you have any idea what you've done? I tilted my head slightly, letting the question hang in the air between us. I think the better question is, do you? Gerald finally stepped forward, his voice low and full of barely contained rage. This is going to cost you, he said, his eyes narrowing. You think this is over? You think you can just humiliate us and walk away? He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. You're a damn fool if you think there won't be consequences for this. I didn't flinch. I didn't back down. I had spent years living under the weight of their threats, their disdain, their condescending remarks about how I would never be anything. I had spent years swallowing my pride, forcing myself to be polite, pretending their words didn't cut deep. But tonight, I didn't feel small anymore. Tonight, I was standing on even ground with them, and they had nothing left to hold over me. I don't care, I said simply. Emily let out a strangled sound, shaking her head furiously as she finally found her voice. You're insane, she spat, her eyes wild with disbelief. You didn't just screw over my parents, you screwed over me. Do you even understand that? You didn't just take revenge on them, you destroyed my wedding. You humiliated me. I looked at her for a long moment, at the girl who had grown up believing she was untouchable, at the girl who had laughed alongside her parents while they treated me like a joke. She wasn't used to consequences. She had never experienced what it was like to be powerless. But tonight, she did. You let them do this to me for years, I said, my voice steady, watching as her anger flickered with something else: confusion, denial, a stubborn refusal to see herself for what she was. You sat there and laughed with them. You never stopped them. You never once defended me, not even when you knew they were wrong. So don't stand here and act like you're some innocent bystander in all of this. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. You are just as bad as they are. Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, wanted to scream at me, but nothing came out. She stood there, her face red, her hands trembling, but for the first time, she didn't have a response. Meredith took a sharp breath, trying one last time to regain control. You think you've won something here? She snapped, her voice full of venom. You think this makes you powerful? It doesn't. It makes you pathetic. This little stunt of yours? It's going to ruin your reputation. You'll never work in this industry again. No one will hire you after this. No one will trust you. You just destroyed your own business, and for what? A grudge. I felt a slow, quiet certainty settle in my chest as I met her furious gaze. Then I guess it's a good thing I don't need your approval to be successful. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the tension. I turned slightly, watching as one of the guests from the reception, an older man dressed in an expensive tailored suit, approached with a curious expression. He glanced between me and Meredith before stopping just a few feet away, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. Excuse me, he said, his voice polite but firm, his gaze settling on me. I couldn't help but overhear this situation. And I have to say, I'm impressed. He offered a slight smile, ignoring the way Meredith stiffened beside me. Not many people would have the guts to do what you just did. It takes a certain kind of person to stand up for themselves like that. I studied him for a moment, recognizing him as one of the wealthier guests from the wedding, someone with influence, someone whose presence carried weight. I happen to own a chain of high-end restaurants, he continued, his smile never wavering. And I think we might have some business to discuss. Meredith's sharp intake of breath was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I turned back to face her, watching as the realization of what had just happened settled into her features. Her lips parted slightly, her face pale, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. She had spent years telling me I would never make it, years making sure I knew I would always be beneath her. And now, in the span of a single night, she had lost everything she thought she had over me. I looked back at the man, offering a small nod. I'd be happy to talk. And with that, I walked away, leaving them standing there in the cold, finally realizing that they had never held any real power over me at all. I sat across from the man in a quiet, high-end lounge a few blocks from the reception hall, the chaos of the wedding left behind, but the weight of the night still settling in my chest. The staff here moved silently, refilling glasses without a sound, their presence barely noticeable, the exact opposite of the scene I had just walked away from. I could still picture Meredith's face, still hear the restrained fury in Gerald's voice, still see Emily standing there, too shocked to speak. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the man in front of me, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of his whiskey glass as he watched me with quiet interest. "I've been to a lot of weddings," he said after a moment, his voice steady, measured. "I've seen a lot of disasters, drunken speeches, bad catering, fights breaking out between in-laws. But I've never seen someone take back control the way you did tonight." He leaned forward slightly, studying me like I was something worth figuring out. "Tell me, was that planned, or was that just years of built-up frustration finally boiling over?" I exhaled slowly, resting my hands against the cool surface of the table. "I didn't plan for it to happen like that," I admitted. "But I knew something like this would happen eventually. They've been doing this for years, and I've let them. I've smiled through it, played along, let them believe they could keep walking all over me. Tonight, I just decided I was done." The man, Richard Calloway, owner of one of the most successful restaurant groups in the city, nodded slightly, as if my answer confirmed something for him. "Good," he said simply, swirling the liquid in his glass before taking a slow sip. "People like them only stop when someone forces them to." He set the glass down, his expression unreadable. "So, tell me about your business." I straightened slightly, my mind shifting back to something I actually knew how to control. "It started small," I began, keeping my voice steady, keeping the focus where it needed to be. "I worked in kitchens for years, learned everything I could, built relationships with the right suppliers. Eventually, I saved enough to open my own catering company. We specialize in high-end events, but we also do private dining experiences, chef's table events, anything that requires precision and quality." I watched his reaction carefully, looking for any sign of skepticism, but he only seemed more intrigued. "We've built a strong reputation over the years. Most of our business comes from referrals. And despite what happened tonight, I have no doubt that every guest at that reception will be talking about us, just maybe not in the way they expected." Richard let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head slightly. "You're right about that. Half the people in that room won't shut up about what you did, and the other half are probably hoping to never hear your name again." He paused, considering something before leaning forward, his voice lowering just slightly. "But you want to know the difference between them? The ones who are angry are the ones who treat people like garbage. The ones who are impressed? They're the ones who understand power when they see it." I didn't respond right away, letting his words settle. He wasn't wrong. The wedding had been filled with people like Meredith and Gerald, people who had spent their entire lives stepping on those they thought were beneath them. But there had also been people there who had seen what I had done and recognized it for what it was, an act of defiance, a refusal to be controlled. And those were the people who mattered. Richard leaned back slightly, drumming his fingers against the table. "I have a proposition for you," he said finally. "I want to bring you on as a partner in one of my new ventures. A private dining concept, exclusive, high-end, invitation only. I've been looking for someone who understands what true quality looks like, someone who doesn't just cater to the wealthy, but actually knows how to make them take notice." He tilted his head slightly. "After tonight, I think you might be exactly what I need." I stared at him, my mind processing his words, my pulse steady despite the weight of what he was offering. This wasn't just a job. This wasn't just another opportunity. This was a seat at the table, a chance to build something bigger than what I had imagined for myself. I had spent so many years fighting to prove my worth, and now, when I had finally stopped trying to convince people like my aunt and uncle that I mattered, someone who actually mattered had noticed me. I took a slow breath, then nodded. "I'm interested." Richard smiled, a sharp, knowing look in his eyes. "Good," he said simply. "We'll talk details soon." He stood, offering his hand, and I shook it, feeling the weight of the moment, knowing that my life had just changed. As he walked away, I sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. The night wasn't how I had expected it to go. I had thought I would leave the reception feeling angry, feeling bitter, feeling like I had burned something down without knowing what would come next. But instead, I felt something else entirely. Relief. I stood, stepping out into the night, the cold air hitting my skin as I exhaled. I pulled out my phone, scrolling past the missed calls from my mother, from relatives who had probably just learned what had happened, before stopping on a single message from one of my chefs. "Everything is packed up. We're with you no matter what." I smiled slightly, typing a quick response before slipping my phone back into my pocket. Good. Because we're just getting started.